Thomas Miller froze, his wrench suspended mid-turn as lightning illuminated the figure stumbling toward his garage through the torrential Austin rain. The woman's torn evening gown clung to her trembling frame, designer heels clicking desperately against wet pavement. This wasn't some random stranger seeking shelter. Her diamond earrings caught the fluorescent light like trapped stars worth more than his annual income. Mrs. Henderson next door dropped her curtain with a sharp gasp, her porch light flickering off in alarm. The coffee shop owner across the street pressed his face against rain-streaked glass, mouth agape at the spectacle unfolding on their quiet working-class street. Thomas remembered his daughter Isabella's words from dinner. "Daddy, you always say angels don't wear fancy dresses." Yet here stood living contradiction, wealth draped in desperation, privilege wrapped in terror. "Help me," she whispered, collapsing against his garage door. The wrench clattered to concrete as Thomas stepped forward, his calloused hands reaching towards silk and sorrow. What kind of hell had driven a millionaire's daughter to his doorstep at 2 a.m.? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Thomas Miller had built his life on two unshakable foundations, protecting his 8-year-old daughter Isabella and never looking back at the career that had cost him everything. 3 years ago, he'd been Dr. Thomas Miller, chief cardiac surgeon at Austin Methodist Hospital, commanding respect in sterile corridors where life and death decisions separated the worthy from the weak. Now, at 34, his hands bore the honest stains of motor oil instead of surgical gloves, and he preferred it that way. The transition hadn't been his choice. One winter night in 2021, 2 patients had arrived simultaneously at his emergency room: Maria Gonzalez, an uninsured housekeeper clutching her chest in agony, and Harrison Wellington III, whose family name graced half the buildings in downtown Austin. Hospital protocol demanded he prioritize the insured patient, the one whose survival meant continued donations to the medical center. Thomas had looked into Maria's terrified eyes, seen her 3 young children crying in the waiting room, and made a choice that destroyed his medical career but saved his soul. While he worked desperately to repair Maria's damaged heart, Harrison Wellington died from complications that might have been preventable with immediate intervention. The Wellington family's fury had been swift and merciless. Medical board hearings, criminal charges for criminal negligence, front-page headlines painting him as a rogue doctor who'd let a pillar of the community die for a woman who couldn't pay her bills. His medical license had been stripped away like a bandage ripped from a wound. The divorce followed quickly. His ex-wife Caroline couldn't tolerate the scandal, the whispered conversations at country club luncheons, the financial uncertainty. She'd moved to California with her new husband, leaving Thomas with full custody of Isabella and a mountain of legal bills that had devoured their savings. They'd lost the house in Westlake, the luxury cars, the private school tuition, everything except each other. Now they lived in a modest 2-bedroom house in East Austin where Thomas ran Miller's garage and drove for Uber during evening hours to make ends meet. Isabella attended Roosevelt Elementary, where her teachers didn't know her father had once held human hearts in his hands. She was a bright child with her mother's blonde curls and her father's stubborn determination, but the chronic asthma she'd inherited from his side of the family required expensive medications that stretched their budget to breaking point. Every month brought the same calculation: rent, groceries, Isabella's inhaler refills at $300 each. Thomas worked 16-hour days without complaint, finding odd satisfaction in the honest predictability of mechanical problems. Engines didn't care about your credentials or your family connections. They either ran or they didn't, and skill was the only currency that mattered. The neighborhood had embraced them as their own. Mrs. Henderson next door watched Isabella after school, refusing payment despite Thomas's insistence. The corner store owner, Miguel, extended credit during tight weeks without judgment. This was community in its purest form, people taking care of people because it was right, not because it was profitable. Thomas had thought his days of impossible choices were behind him. He'd been wrong. The woman collapsed against Thomas's garage door, her breath coming in ragged gasps that reminded him too much of Isabella's asthma attacks. Up close, he could see the details that painted a picture of violence. A torn strap on her evening gown, mascara streaked down her cheeks like black tears, and a small cut on her left palm that was still bleeding. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Thomas kept his voice gentle, the way he'd learned to speak to frightened patients in the emergency room. "Do you need me to call the police?" She shook her head frantically, blonde hair whipping across her face. "No police. Please, I just need somewhere safe until morning." Her accent carried the polished edges of private school education, but terror had stripped away any pretense. "I know how this looks, a stranger showing up at your door." "I know you have every reason to say no." Thomas glanced back toward his house, where Isabella slept peacefully in her small bedroom decorated with drawings of horses and fairy tales. Bringing a stranger home violated every rule of single parenthood he'd established. Yet something in the woman's eyes reminded him of Maria Gonzalez that night in the emergency room, the desperation of someone who had nowhere else to turn. "What happened to you?" he asked, stepping closer but keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "I was at a charity gala downtown," she said, then laughed bitterly. "Charity! God, the irony! I left early, walked to my car in the parking garage. 3 men were waiting. They took my purse, my phone, everything. When I tried to run, I tripped and tore my dress." She held up her bleeding palm. "Fell on broken glass." Thomas had worked enough late-night emergency shifts to recognize the signs of someone telling the truth about trauma. The shaking hands, the way her eyes darted to shadows, the protective way she held her injured hand, all authentic responses to violence. "You walked all the way here from downtown?" "I didn't know where else to go. I've been wandering for hours, and your garage was the only place with lights on." She looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. "I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I can pay you back somehow. I just need a safe place to think." The rain was coming down harder now, turning the August heat into humid misery. Thomas thought about Isabella, about the responsibility of protecting her, about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Then he thought about the kind of man he wanted his daughter to grow up knowing, someone who helped people in need, even when it was inconvenient. "Can you tell me your first name?" he asked. "Sophia," she said without hesitation. "I'm Thomas. I live here with my 8-year-old daughter, Isabella. She's asleep, and I need to know that having you in my house won't put her in any danger." Sophia straightened, and for a moment Thomas glimpsed something fierce beneath the vulnerability. "I would never hurt a child. Never. I promise you that on my life." There was something in her voice, a conviction that resonated with his own protective instincts. Thomas made his decision, the same way he'd made impossible choices in the operating room, trusting his instincts even when logic argued otherwise. "Come inside," he said, opening the side door that led from the garage into his kitchen. "We'll get that cut cleaned up and find you some dry clothes." Sophia hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing into his world required more courage than facing her attackers. "I don't even know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," Thomas said, meaning it. "A man's worth isn't measured by his bank account. It's measured by how he treats people when nobody's watching." As she stepped into his modest kitchen, Thomas noticed how she moved, carefully, as if she'd never been in a space where every piece of furniture wasn't perfectly arranged by professional decorators. Her eyes took in the details. Isabella's drawings held to the refrigerator with dollar store magnets, the chipped coffee mug that read "World's Best Dad," the small pile of medical bills stacked neatly beside the sink. "Your daughter," Sophia said softly, studying a crayon drawing of a stick figure, man, and a smaller stick figure girl holding hands under a rainbow. She draws you with a smile. Isabella sees the best in everyone, Thomas said, moving to the cabinet to retrieve a first aid kit. It's both her greatest strength and what keeps me awake at night worrying about her. Outside, thunder rolled across the Texas sky, and Thomas wondered if he'd just made the best decision of his life or the biggest mistake. Time would tell, but for tonight, he'd chosen compassion over caution. In a world that seemed increasingly divided between those who had everything and those who had nothing, maybe that choice would make all the difference. Morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as Thomas prepared breakfast, moving quietly to avoid waking Isabella. He'd given Sophia his old University of Texas sweatshirt and a pair of sweatpants that hung loose on her slender frame, transforming her from mysterious socialite to something resembling a college student. She sat at his small dining table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring out at the neighborhood coming to life. "Daddy?" Isabella's sleepy voice drifted from the hallway. "Who's the pretty lady?" Thomas turned to find his daughter standing in the doorway, blonde curls sticking up at impossible angles, clutching her worn, stuffed elephant. Her blue eyes, so much like Caroline's, were bright with curiosity rather than concern, and Thomas felt a familiar surge of protective love mixed with worry about how to explain the situation. "This is Sophia," he said carefully. "She needed help last night, so she stayed on the couch." "Remember how we talked about helping people when they're in trouble?" Isabella nodded solemnly, then walked directly to Sophia with the fearless confidence that only children possess. "Are you okay now? Daddy says hurt people need extra kindness." Sophia's composure cracked slightly, her eyes glistening as she looked down at Isabella. "I'm much better now, sweetheart. Your daddy is a very good man." "The best daddy in the whole world," Isabella agreed matter-of-factly. "He makes dinosaur pancakes on Saturdays and knows how to fix everything that breaks." She climbed onto the chair beside Sophia. "What's your favorite dinosaur?" "Mine's a triceratops because they have 3 horns and they protect their families." Thomas watched this exchange with a mixture of amusement and concern. Isabella had always been precociously social, but she'd been asking more frequently about why she didn't have a mother like her classmates. The longing in her voice when she talked about complete families broke his heart, especially knowing that Caroline had chosen her new life over their daughter without a backward glance. "I think I like triceratops too," Sophia said seriously. "Family protection sounds very important." As Thomas prepared breakfast, he noticed how naturally Sophia interacted with Isabella. Not the awkward condescension many adults displayed around children, but genuine engagement. She listened to Isabella's rambling stories about school and her drawings and her best friend Marcus, who had lost his 2 front teeth, responding with appropriate enthusiasm and follow-up questions. The normalcy of the scene felt dangerous. Thomas had worked hard to create stability for Isabella after the chaos of the divorce and career implosion. Bringing temporary people into their lives risked disrupting the careful balance they'd achieved. "Can Sophia stay for dinosaur pancakes?" Isabella asked as Thomas flipped eggs in the cast-iron skillet his grandmother had given him. "Sophia has her own family to get back to," Thomas said gently, glancing at their house guest. "She was just visiting for the night." Something flickered across Sophia's face, an expression Thomas couldn't quite interpret. Pain, maybe, or longing. "Actually," she said quietly, "I don't have anywhere I need to be today. If you don't mind the company, I'd love to stay for breakfast." Isabella cheered as if this was the best news she'd heard all week. Thomas felt a warning bell in his mind, but the joy on his daughter's face made it hard to object. One breakfast wouldn't hurt anything. They ate together at the small table, Isabella chattering about her plans for the weekend while Sophia asked questions about her school and friends. Thomas found himself studying their guest, noting details that didn't quite fit her story. Her table manners were impeccable, ingrained rather than conscious. She knew exactly how to fold her napkin and where to place her silverware. Her hands, despite the cut from the previous night, were soft and manicured, not the hands of someone who worked for a living. "Daddy used to be a doctor," Isabella announced proudly, unaware of how Thomas tensed at the words. "He saved people's hearts, but now he fixes cars because cars are important too." Sophia's eyes widened slightly. "A doctor? That's incredible. What made you change careers?" The innocent question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd hoped to avoid this conversation, at least until Sophia was safely back to whatever life she'd escaped from. "Sometimes people need fresh starts," he said carefully. "Medicine wasn't the right fit anymore." "But you were good at it, weren't you?" Isabella insisted. "Mrs. Henderson says you have healing hands, and you always know what to do when I can't breathe right." Thomas saw Sophia process this information, her expression shifting as pieces of some puzzle clicked into place. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him, a failed doctor running from his mistakes, or a man who'd chosen principle over prosperity. After breakfast, Isabella convinced Sophia to help her work on a puzzle while Thomas did dishes. He found himself stealing glances at them, noting how naturally Sophia seemed to fit into their morning routine. She praised Isabella's problem-solving skills, offered gentle guidance when pieces didn't fit, and listened with genuine interest to stories about each puzzle piece's imagined personality. "Sophia," Isabella said suddenly, looking up from the puzzle with serious blue eyes, "do you think some people are meant to be families, even if they didn't start out that way?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, loaded with 8-year-old wisdom that often cuts straight to the heart of adult complexities. Thomas froze at the sink, a plate suspended in soapy water waiting for Sophia's response. "I think," Sophia said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "that the best families are made of people who choose to love each other every single day. It doesn't matter how they found each other." Isabella beamed as if this confirmed something she'd suspected all along. "That's what I think too. Love is a choice, not an accident." Thomas turned from the sink to find Sophia looking at him with an expression that made his breath catch. There was something vulnerable and hopeful in her eyes, but also something guarded, as if she was holding back important pieces of herself. The moment was interrupted by Isabella's sudden coughing fit. Thomas was at her side instantly, recognizing the distinctive wheeze that meant her asthma was flaring up. He retrieved her rescue inhaler from the kitchen counter, helping her coordinate her breathing while counting the dosages. "Better?" he asked as Isabella's breathing steadied. She nodded, leaning against his chest with the exhausted relief of someone whose body had just reminded them of its fragility. "Sorry, Daddy. I forgot to take my morning medicine." "Never apologize for something you can't control, sweetheart," Thomas said, though he was mentally calculating how many doses remained in the current inhaler. 2 weeks, maybe less. Another $300 expense on a budget already stretched to its limits. Sophia watched this interaction with intense focus, and Thomas realized she was seeing something that most people missed: the constant undercurrent of medical worry that shaped every day of their lives. Isabella's asthma wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a sword hanging over their heads, ready to transform any normal day into a crisis that could destroy them financially. Over the following week, Sophia became woven into the fabric of their daily routine with an ease that both comforted and alarmed Thomas. She'd claimed to be waiting for replacement identification documents, a story that explained her extended stay without raising too many questions from neighbors who'd grown protective of Thomas and Isabella since the divorce scandal. What surprised Thomas most was how naturally she adapted to their modest lifestyle. The first morning, he'd expected her to recoil from the chipped dishes and second-hand furniture, but instead she'd asked how she could help. When he'd suggested she could handle breakfast while he got ready for work, he'd returned to find her staring helplessly at the stovetop, holding eggs like fragile grenades. "I've never actually cooked anything," she'd admitted with embarrassment that seemed genuine. "I mean, I've watched cooking shows, but that's different from actually doing it." Isabella had taken charge with 8-year-old authority, standing on a step stool to demonstrate proper egg-cracking technique while Sophia took notes on a napkin, as if learning surgical procedures. The sight of this elegant woman being tutored in basic domestic skills by his daughter had been both amusing and oddly touching. Now, as Thomas watched Sophia attempt to fold laundry in his living room, he marveled at her determination to master tasks that most adults took for granted. She approached each chore with scientific precision, studying his techniques and practicing until she achieved acceptable results. Her dedication suggested someone accustomed to perfection, but her incompetence revealed a life where such skills had never been necessary. "Daddy, can we keep her?" Isabella asked one evening as they worked on homework together. She'd taken to asking this question daily, as if repetition might change the fundamental reality that Sophia's presence was temporary. "People aren't pets, sweetheart," Thomas replied gently. "Sophia has her own life somewhere else. She's just visiting until she can get back to it." "But what if her life is sad?" Isabella persisted with the stubborn logic of childhood. "What if she likes our life better? Mrs. Henderson says sometimes God sends people to each other when they need helping." Thomas glanced across the room where Sophia sat reading a medical journal she'd found in his closet, one of the few professional remnants he hadn't been able to throw away. She'd been absorbed in it for hours, occasionally asking questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of cardiac procedures. "Where did you learn about medicine?" he'd asked earlier. "I volunteered at free clinics in college," she'd replied. "Pre-med track before I switched majors. I always found the heart fascinating, how it just keeps beating, no matter what trauma the body experiences." The conversation had stayed with Thomas because something in her voice suggested personal experience with trauma. He'd learned to recognize the signs during his residency, the way people spoke about pain they'd lived through rather than simply observed. Their evening routine had evolved naturally. Sophia would help Isabella with homework while Thomas prepared dinner, their voices creating a domestic harmony that filled spaces in his house he hadn't realized were empty. After Isabella's bath, they'd sit together on the couch, Isabella between them, reading stories or working puzzles while the Texas heat gradually surrendered to night breezes. These moments felt dangerous in their perfection. Thomas found himself watching Sophia's face as she reacted to Isabella's stories, noting the genuine delight in her expressions. She never seemed impatient with 8-year-old chatter or dismissive of childish concerns. Instead, she engaged with Isabella's world as if it were as important as any adult conversation. The financial pressure remained constant. Thomas had picked up extra Uber shifts, working until 2 in the morning to build a buffer for Isabella's medication costs. Sophia had noticed his exhaustion quietly taking over more household responsibilities without making him feel diminished. She'd learned to prepare simple meals, manage laundry, and even basic car maintenance tasks after watching him work on the neighbors' vehicles in his driveway. "You don't have to do all this," Thomas had told her one morning, finding her scrubbing his bathroom with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb. "I want to contribute," she'd replied. "You've given me something precious, a place to belong, even temporarily. Let me earn my keep." The phrase, "place to belong," had echoed in Thomas's mind all day. It suggested someone who'd never felt truly at home anywhere, despite what appeared to be privileged circumstances. He'd begun to suspect that Sophia's story was more complicated than a simple mugging, but he respected her privacy too much to push for details. Their first real conflict came when Isabella's inhaler ran empty sooner than expected. Thomas had calculated the doses carefully, but a particularly humid week had triggered more frequent attacks. As he stared at the empty device, his stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. "I can get a temporary inhaler from the pharmacy," he told Isabella, who was breathing with the careful shallowness that meant her airways were constricting. "Just need to make a quick call about payment arrangements." Sophia was folding towels nearby, but Thomas noticed how still she'd become, listening to his side of the phone conversation with the pharmacy. When he hung up, his face must have revealed his frustration. "They can't extend credit until next week," he said, more to himself than to her. "Insurance won't approve early refill without prior authorization from a doctor we can't afford to see." Isabella wheezed softly from her position on the couch, trying to stay calm the way he'd taught her, but Thomas could see fear creeping into her eyes. Nothing terrified him more than watching his daughter struggle to breathe while he felt powerless to help. "There's an urgent care clinic that takes walk-ins," Sophia said quietly. "I could drive you both there. They might be able to provide a temporary solution." Thomas looked at her sharply. They'd been sharing his old Honda, but she'd never mentioned having a driver's license or access to another vehicle. "You have a car?" "I could arrange for one," she said carefully. "A friend owes me a favor." The vague explanation triggered Thomas's instincts. During his medical career, he'd learned to recognize when patients were hiding important information. Sophia's offer felt genuine, but the way she avoided specifics suggested complications she wasn't ready to discuss. "We'll manage," he said, perhaps more curtly than necessary. "I'll figure something out." But as Isabella's breathing became more labored, Thomas felt the familiar weight of impossible choices. His pride warred with his desperation, while Sophia watched with an expression that seemed to understand exactly what he was experiencing. That night, after Isabella had finally fallen asleep with the help of an over-the-counter bronchodilator that provided minimal relief, Thomas sat on his front porch steps, head in his hands. The weight of single parenthood pressed down like Texas humidity, constant, exhausting, inescapable. Sophia joined him on the steps, maintaining respectful distance while offering silent companionship. They sat in comfortable quiet, listening to the neighborhood settle into night rhythms. "You're a remarkable father," she said eventually. "Isabella is lucky to have someone who loves her so completely." "Sometimes love isn't enough," Thomas replied, his voice rough with exhaustion and worry. "Sometimes you need resources you don't have, connections you've lost, options that disappeared when you made choices other people couldn't forgive." "What kind of choices?" Thomas considered how much to reveal. Sophia had been honest about her vulnerabilities. Maybe he owed her the same trust. "I used to be chief of cardiac surgery at Austin Methodist. 3 years ago, I had to choose between saving 2 patients, one who could pay, one who couldn't. I chose wrong, according to everyone who mattered." "You chose based on medical need rather than financial status?" "I chose based on what felt right in the moment." A mother of 3 whose heart was failing, or a banker whose family owned half the city. I saved the mother. The banker died while I was in surgery. His family destroyed my career, my marriage, everything I'd built. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Do you regret it?" Thomas considered the question that had haunted him for 3 years. "I regret the consequences for Isabella. I regret that my principles cost her the security every child deserves. But the choice itself, Maria Gonzalez is alive because I made it. Her children still have their mother. And you have your integrity. Integrity doesn't pay for asthma medication." Sophia turned to face him, her expression serious in the dim porch light. "What if there were a way to help Isabella without compromising your principles? Would you consider it?" Something in her tone made Thomas wary. "What kind of way?" "I have some connections in the medical field." People who believe healthcare should be about healing, not profit. They might be able to provide Isabella's medications at cost or connect you with clinical trials for new treatments. The offer was tempting, but Thomas had learned to be suspicious of solutions that seemed too convenient. What would these connections want in return? Nothing from you, Sophia said. Consider it paying forward the kindness you've shown me. As they sat on the porch steps, Thomas felt the weight of another impossible choice approaching. Accept help from someone whose motives he couldn't fully understand, or watch his daughter suffer while his pride remained intact. The familiar tension between principle and pragmatism tightened like a tourniquet around his chest. Inside the house, Isabella coughed in her sleep, and Thomas made his decision. Sometimes love meant swallowing pride. Sometimes protecting the people who mattered most required accepting help from unexpected sources. "If your connections can help Isabella," he said quietly, "I'd like to hear more about them." Sophia nodded, but Thomas noticed something flicker across her face, relief mixed with what might have been guilt, as if helping Isabella would cost her something she wasn't prepared to discuss. The call came at 3 in the morning, piercing through Thomas's exhausted sleep like a fire alarm. Isabella's breathing had deteriorated rapidly, her small chest working overtime as she fought for air that seemed to slip away faster than she could draw it in. By the time Thomas reached her bedroom, she was sitting upright in bed, eyes wide with the panic that accompanied severe asthma attacks. "Daddy, I can't breathe," she whispered, each word a struggle against airways that felt like collapsed tunnels. Thomas scooped her into his arms, his medical training taking control even as parental terror flooded his system. Her pulse was rapid but strong, skin color still good, but the wheeze in her chest had deepened to a concerning level. The rescue inhaler provided minimal relief, a sign that this attack was beyond what they could manage at home. "We're going to the hospital, sweetheart," he said, wrapping her in a blanket while calculating drive times to different emergency rooms. Austin Methodist was closest, but the irony of returning to the hospital that had destroyed his career felt like salt in an open wound. Sophia appeared in the hallway, fully dressed as if she'd been expecting this crisis. "I'll drive," she said, producing car keys that definitely didn't belong to his Honda. "You focus on Isabella." Thomas was too frightened to question how she'd materialized a vehicle or why she seemed so prepared for medical emergencies. Isabella's condition was deteriorating, and his daughter's life took precedence over mysteries he couldn't solve. The car turned out to be a black BMW sedan, immaculately maintained and equipped with GPS navigation that Sophia operated with practiced familiarity. She drove with confidence through Austin's empty streets, taking routes that suggested intimate knowledge of the city's traffic patterns even at pre-dawn hours. "How long has she had asthma this severe?" Sophia asked as they navigated toward the medical district. "Since she was 4, Thomas replied, monitoring Isabella's breathing while trying to keep his voice calm for her benefit. "She was born premature, spent weeks in NICU. Her lungs never fully developed the resilience they needed." Isabella's head rested against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and rapid. Thomas could feel the familiar helplessness that accompanied these crises. The knowledge that his medical expertise meant nothing without proper equipment and medication. He was just another terrified parent watching his child suffer. They arrived at Austin Methodist Emergency Department as the morning shift was beginning. Sophia pulled directly to the ambulance bay, ignoring signs about authorized vehicles only. When a security guard approached to object, she handed him something, Thomas couldn't see what, that made him step back and wave them through. "Take her inside," Sophia said. "I'll handle the car and paperwork." Thomas carried Isabella through doors he hadn't entered in 3 years, past nurses' stations where he'd once commanded respect and authority. Now he was just another desperate parent in the waiting room, clutching insurance cards he wasn't sure would cover emergency treatment. The triage nurse recognized Isabella's distress immediately, whisking them into an examination room where familiar sounds and smells triggered muscle memory from Thomas's surgical days. The attending physician was Dr. Sarah Chen, someone Thomas had worked with during his tenure at Methodist. Her face registered surprise at seeing him, but professional protocol took precedence. "What's Isabella's baseline treatment?" Dr. Chen asked, listening to Isabella's lungs with focused intensity. Thomas rattled off the medication list, dosages, and trigger patterns with clinical precision that made Dr. Chen pause. "You have medical training?" "I used to work here," Thomas said simply, not wanting to elaborate while Isabella struggled for breath on the examination table. Dr. Chen's eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned, but she maintained professional focus. "We need to start her on continuous nebulizer treatments and monitor her oxygen saturation. This is a significant exacerbation that's going to require several hours of intensive treatment." As medical staff worked around Isabella, Thomas felt the familiar weight of hospital costs accumulating. Emergency department visits, medications, potential admission if her condition didn't improve, expenses that could consume months of his garage income in a single night. Sophia appeared beside him as if materialized from thin air, having completed whatever arrangements she'd made for the car and registration paperwork. "How is she?" "Responding to treatment, but slowly," Thomas said, watching monitors that displayed his daughter's vital signs in precise digital readouts. "This is going to be expensive." "Insurance will cover emergency treatment," Sophia said with confidence that suggested familiarity with healthcare financing. "Our insurance has a $5,000 deductible and only covers 80% after that," Thomas replied. "One night here could cost us everything." Sophia was quiet for a moment, studying Isabella's pale face as nebulizer medication worked to open her constricted airways. What if cost wasn't a factor? What would be the best possible treatment for her? Thomas looked at her sharply. "Cost is always a factor. That's the reality of medicine in America. You get the care you can afford, not necessarily the care you need." "But hypothetically," Sophia pressed, "if money weren't an issue, what would you want for Isabella?" The question forced Thomas to confront dreams he'd buried when his medical career ended. A full pulmonology workup with the latest imaging technology, genetic testing to identify specific asthma triggers, access to newer medications that aren't covered by basic insurance plans, maybe even evaluation for experimental treatments that could improve her long-term prognosis. That sounds reasonable for a child whose father understands her condition better than most doctors. Something in Sophia's tone made Thomas study her face more carefully. "How do you know about medical care quality, about insurance limitations and treatment options?" Before Sophia could answer, Dr. Chen returned with Isabella's latest test results. "Her oxygen levels are improving, but I'd like to keep her for observation through the morning. Sometimes these severe attacks can have delayed complications." Thomas nodded, though each additional hour of hospital care added zeros to a bill he couldn't afford. "Whatever she needs." As Dr. Chen left to arrange admission paperwork, Sophia placed a gentle hand on Thomas's arm. "Can I speak with you privately for a moment?" They stepped into the hallway, where the controlled chaos of emergency medicine continued around them. Sophia seemed to struggle with internal conflict before speaking. "Thomas, I need to tell you something important about myself. Something that might change how you feel about our friendship." Warning bells sounded in Thomas's mind. "What kind of something?" "I haven't been completely honest about my circumstances. The night you found me, I wasn't just a random mugging victim. I was running away from a life that had become a prison, even though it looked perfect from the outside." Thomas waited, sensing that interruption would derail whatever confession she was building toward. My father is Richard Bennett. He owns Bennett Development Corporation, office buildings, shopping centers, residential complexes throughout Texas. The charity gala I left that night was in my honor, celebrating my engagement to Senator Morrison's son, a marriage that would unite two political dynasties and generate enormous business opportunities. The words hit Thomas like physical blows. Richard Bennett, the real estate mogul whose name appeared on half the construction projects in Austin, whose net worth was measured in billions rather than millions, whose social circle included governors and congressmen and federal judges. "You're telling me you're a billionaire's daughter?" Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm telling you that I've spent my entire life in a world where people are commodities and relationships are business transactions, where love is a luxury that interferes with profitable arrangements, where I've never met anyone who helped a stranger without calculating what they could gain in return." Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Every moment of the past week took on new meaning. Sophia's incompetence with basic tasks, her knowledge of medical procedures, her mysterious ability to produce expensive cars and navigate complex systems. "Is any of it real?" he asked. "Your feelings for Isabella, for our life together? Is it just wealthy girl playing house with the poor people?" Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "It's the most real thing I've ever experienced. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Not because of my father's money or my social connections, but because of who I am as a person. And now that Isabella needs expensive medical care, you're revealing your true identity so you can swoop in and save the day. Make yourself feel good about helping the unfortunate." "That's not," Sophia began, but Thomas cut her off. "How long have you been planning this? Did you research us before that night? Figure out exactly what emotional buttons to push to make us dependent on your charity?" The accusation hung between them like toxic smoke. Sophia's face crumpled as if he'd struck her, but Thomas felt too betrayed to care about her pain. Everything he'd believed about their connection had been built on deception. Dr. Chen approached before Sophia could respond. "Mr. Miller, we have Isabella's admission paperwork ready, but there seems to be some confusion about insurance authorization. Could you come to the billing office?" Thomas followed her down familiar hallways, leaving Sophia standing alone in the emergency department corridor. As they walked, Dr. Chen spoke quietly. "Thomas, I need to ask, do you have any idea who handled your daughter's registration tonight? Someone appears to have established a medical trust fund in Isabella's name that covers all treatment costs. The paperwork came through hospital administration channels I've never seen used for individual patients." Thomas stopped walking. "What kind of trust fund?" "The kind that requires approval from our board of directors and legal department. Someone with serious influence made this happen, and they did it in less than 2 hours. That doesn't occur by accident." Through the corridor window, Thomas could see Sophia sitting beside Isabella's hospital bed, reading quietly from a children's book, while his daughter dozed under the influence of medication that was finally allowing her to breathe freely. The scene looked peaceful, domestic, like a mother caring for her child. But now Thomas understood the true cost of that peace. Sophia hadn't just hidden her wealth. She'd used it to manipulate their circumstances, creating a crisis that only she could solve. His daughter's medical emergency had become another business transaction in a world where everything had a price. The woman he'd thought he was falling in love with didn't exist. She was a performance, a role played by someone who could never understand what it meant to choose between principles and survival, because she'd never faced that choice. Her biggest decision had been which trust fund to establish. As Thomas stood in the hospital corridor where his medical career had died, watching the woman who'd deceived him care for his daughter with what appeared to be genuine love, he faced another impossible choice. Accept help that would solve all of Isabella's medical problems, or maintain his integrity by rejecting charity from someone who'd built their relationship on lies. Either choice would cost him something precious. The question was whether he could live with losing his pride or losing the woman who'd made him believe in love again, even if that love had been built on deception. The confrontation Thomas had been dreading arrived 3 days after Isabella's hospital discharge. Richard Bennett appeared at Thomas's garage without warning, stepping out of a black Bentley that cost more than Thomas would earn in 5 years. He was exactly what Thomas had expected: silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of authority that came from never having to ask twice for anything. 2 men in expensive suits flanked him, their presence unnecessary but calculated to demonstrate power. Thomas wiped grease from his hands with a shop rag, noting how the billionaire's eyes swept dismissively over the modest garage, the second-hand equipment, the oil stains on concrete that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. "Mr. Miller," Richard Bennett said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of old Texas money, "we need to discuss my daughter." "Sophia's an adult," Thomas replied, keeping his tone level despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "She makes her own choices." Richard's laugh was cold, brittle as autumn leaves. "Does she? Or have you simply provided her with an attractive fantasy that allows her to avoid real responsibility?" The accusation hit its target. Thomas had wondered the same thing during sleepless nights since learning Sophia's identity. Was their relationship genuine connection or elaborate rebellion by someone who'd never faced actual consequences? "Your daughter came to me seeking help," Thomas said. "I gave her what she needed: safety, respect, a place where she's valued for who she is rather than what she's worth." "And what she's worth is considerable," Richard countered, stepping closer with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating others through sheer presence. "Sophia is heir to a $2.8 billion empire. Her engagement to Senator Morrison's son represents strategic alliances that will benefit thousands of employees, millions of constituents." "You're asking her to abandon all of that for what? Your daughter's medical bills and a life of financial struggle?" The words struck Thomas like physical blows because they contained uncomfortable truth. What could he offer Sophia beyond love and the daily challenges of working-class existence? His garage barely generated enough income to cover basic expenses. Isabella's medical needs would only grow more expensive as she aged. Was asking Sophia to choose this life over security and influence selfish rather than romantic? "I'm not asking her to abandon anything," Thomas said, though doubt crept into his voice. "I'm not asking her to choose at all. If she wants to return to her previous life, that's her decision." Richard studied him with calculating eyes that missed nothing. "You really believe that, don't you? That she can simply walk away from obligations that have been building for decades? That love conquers all financial reality?" Before Thomas could respond, Sophia's voice cut through the tension. "He believes in something you never understood, Father. He believes that people matter more than profits." She stood in the garage doorway, wearing one of Thomas's old work shirts over jeans that had cost more than his monthly rent. The contrast between her natural elegance and working-class clothes created a visual representation of the impossible choice she faced. "Sophia," Richard's voice softened with what might have been genuine affection, "come home. This experiment has gone on long enough. Senator Morrison is being patient, but his family won't wait indefinitely for you to come to your senses." "My senses?" Sophia stepped forward, her posture straightening with determination Thomas had seen building over recent days. "You mean my willingness to marry a man I don't love to further business interests I don't share?" "I mean your responsibility to the legacy your mother and I built for you," Richard replied, his own voice hardening. "Sarah didn't die so you could throw away everything we've worked for." The mention of her mother hit Sophia like a physical blow. Thomas saw her flinch, saw decades of guilt and manipulation written in the brief crumbling of her composure. Richard noticed, too, pressing his advantage with the ruthless efficiency of someone who'd built an empire through exploiting others' weaknesses. "Your mother understood duty," Richard continued. "She knew that personal desires sometimes must be sacrificed for greater good. She married me not just for love, but because our union created opportunities that benefited everyone around us." "Mother married you because she loved you," Sophia said, but uncertainty flickered in her voice. "Your mother married me because it was the right choice for everyone involved," Richard corrected, "just as your marriage to Jonathan Morrison is the right choice now. Don't dishonor her memory by throwing away the future she died trying to secure for you." Thomas watched this exchange with growing understanding of the psychological chains that bound Sophia to her father's world. Richard Bennett wielded guilt like a surgeon wielded a scalpel, precisely, efficiently, with intimate knowledge of exactly where to cut for maximum damage. "What about Isabella?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about Thomas? They need what money can provide," Richard interrupted. "Medical care, educational opportunities, financial security. Things that noble poverty can't deliver, no matter how pure the intentions." He gestured toward one of his associates, who produced a leather portfolio from his briefcase. "I've prepared a trust fund for Isabella Miller. $2 million professionally managed, providing for all her medical expenses through adulthood, plus college tuition at any institution she chooses. All it requires is your signature on marriage documents that are already prepared." The offer hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. $2 million, enough to transform Isabella's life, to guarantee her the medical care and educational opportunities that Thomas's love alone couldn't provide. The price was simply Sophia's freedom and any chance of the family they might have built together. Thomas felt the familiar weight of impossible choices crushing down on his chest. Accept charity that would solve all his daughter's problems while destroying the woman he loved, or watch Isabella struggle with inadequate medical care because his pride couldn't bend. "Take the money," he said quietly, the words tearing out of his throat like broken glass. Both Sophia and Richard stared at him in surprise. "Take the money," Thomas repeated, meeting Sophia's eyes with pain he couldn't hide. "Isabella deserves every advantage we can give her. Your father's right. Love doesn't pay for asthma medication or college tuition. She needs security more than I need my principles." "Thomas, no," Sophia whispered, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "We can find another way. There has to be another solution." "There isn't," Thomas said, forcing steel into his voice while his heart shattered. "Your father's offering Isabella everything I can't provide. How can I choose my feelings over her future?" Richard nodded with satisfaction, recognizing victory when he achieved it. "A wise decision, Mr. Miller. You're thinking like a parent rather than a romantic." But as his associate prepared the paperwork, Thomas noticed something in Richard's expression that didn't match his triumphant words. A flicker of something that might have been regret or recognition of a cost he hadn't fully calculated. Sophia stood frozen between the two men who claimed to love her, her face a mask of devastation as she realized that once again the people she cared about were making decisions about her life without considering what she might want. "I have conditions," she said suddenly, her voice gaining strength. "If I'm going to sacrifice my happiness for everyone else's benefit, I want guarantees." Richard raised an eyebrow but nodded for her to continue. "The trust fund for Isabella includes provisions for experimental treatments and research participation. Thomas gets his medical license restored with your influence and backing. No more punishment for choosing compassion over profit. And the engagement announcement doesn't happen until Isabella is stable and Thomas has rebuilt his career." "Sophia," Thomas began, but she cut him off. "These are my terms," she said, looking directly at her father. "You want me to honor Mother's memory by sacrificing personal happiness for duty? Fine, but I'm going to make sure that sacrifice actually helps the people I love, not just your business interests." Richard considered this for a long moment, calculating costs and benefits with the cold efficiency that had built his fortune. Finally, he nodded. "Agreed. Though I should point out that restoring Mr. Miller's medical career will require significant political influence and considerable time. Then we have time to make sure Isabella receives the best possible care while we wait," Sophia replied. As the three adults negotiated the terms of trading love for security, none of them noticed Isabella standing in the doorway, having returned home from school to find her small world being divided up like assets in a business merger. Her 8-year-old mind couldn't understand the complex adult motivations at play, but she understood enough to know that the family she dreamed of was being torn apart by forces beyond her control. The little girl who'd asked if some people were meant to be families, even if they didn't start out that way, was about to learn that sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome the harsh mathematics of economic reality. The truth came to light 3 weeks later, hidden in a manila folder that fell from Richard Bennett's briefcase during what was supposed to be their final meeting. As Sophia bent to retrieve scattered documents, her eyes caught on a name that stopped her heart: Maria Elena Gonzalez. The file contained medical records, birth certificates, and adoption papers that painted a picture so devastating it took several moments for Sophia to process the implications. Maria Gonzalez, the uninsured woman Thomas had saved 3 years ago, had been her biological mother. "What is this?" Sophia's voice was barely a whisper as she held up the adoption decree dated 27 years earlier. Richard Bennett's face went ashen. For the first time since she'd known him, her father looked genuinely afraid. "Sophia, let me explain. Maria Gonzalez died giving birth to me, didn't she?" The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. "And you adopted me because you couldn't have children with Mother." "That's not—" "It wasn't that simple," Richard stammered, his usual composure crumbling. "Your mother and I tried for years. When we learned about Maria's situation, we thought we could help." "Help? By taking her baby?" Sophia's voice rose with each word. "Did she even want to give me up?" Thomas, who had been sitting silently during what was supposed to be the signing of final agreements, looked up from the scattered papers. "Maria Gonzalez was 19 when she died. I remember her case from medical school. Complications during delivery that could have been prevented with better prenatal care." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Sophia's ragged breathing as she processed this revelation. The woman Thomas had risked everything to save had been her birth mother. The choice that destroyed his career had been, in cosmic irony, an attempt to honor the memory of someone connected to them both. "You've known this entire time," Sophia said to her father, her voice deadly quiet. "You've watched Thomas suffer for saving my mother's life, and you said nothing." "Maria died in childbirth 27 years ago," Richard said defensively. "The woman Thomas operated on was a different Maria Gonzalez. It's a common name in the Hispanic community." "Don't lie to me anymore," Sophia snapped, grabbing another document from the floor. "This is her death certificate. Maria Elena Gonzalez died March 15, 1997, from complications following emergency cesarean section. The same Maria Elena Gonzalez listed as my birth mother." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as understanding dawned. "The patient I operated on 3 years ago was also named Maria Gonzalez, but she was 42 years old with 3 children. Different person entirely." "But you let me believe—" Sophia turned on her father with fury that made him step backward. "You let me believe that Thomas had somehow failed my birth mother. You used my mother's memory to manipulate me into this engagement." Richard's mask finally slipped completely, revealing a broken man who had built his empire on foundations of guilt and deception. After Maria died, I couldn't bear the thought of losing anyone else I loved. Your mother, Sarah, she wanted to know about your birth parents, wanted to honor their memory. But I was terrified that if you learned the truth, you'd want to find your biological family, your roots. I'd lose you the same way I lost Maria. So you created an elaborate lie to keep me isolated and dependent, Sophia said, pieces of her manipulated childhood clicking into place. Every time I showed interest in social work or helping the poor, you discouraged it because it might lead me back to my origins. I gave you everything, Richard protested. The best education, unlimited opportunities, a future most people can only dream of. You gave me a gilded prison, Sophia cut him off. And you destroyed Thomas's career because saving someone named Maria Gonzalez reminded you of your own guilt about taking me from my birth family. Thomas stood slowly, his mind reeling from revelations that reframed everything he thought he understood about his life. The Harrison Wellington III who died that night, his family's vendetta against me, that was orchestrated by you? Richard's silence was confirmation enough. You used your influence to make sure I lost my medical license, didn't you? Thomas continued, his voice building with controlled rage. You turned saving a life into a career-ending scandal because it triggered your own trauma. I couldn't let doctors think they could ignore proper protocols whenever they felt compassionate, Richard said weakly. The medical system depends on following established procedures. The medical system depends on saving lives, Thomas interrupted. But you were so consumed by guilt over Maria's death that you punished me for succeeding where the doctors 27 years ago had failed. Isabella, who had been playing quietly in the corner during what adults had told her was an important business meeting, looked up at the raised voices with confusion and growing fear. Daddy, why is everyone yelling? The innocence of her question cut through the adult anger like a knife. Here was an 8-year-old child whose entire future had been shaped by tragedies that occurred decades before her birth, by guilt and deception and the inability of broken adults to heal from their wounds. Sophia knelt beside Isabella, her face streaked with tears. Sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt people they love. My father made some very big mistakes, and now we're trying to figure out how to fix them. Can't you just say sorry? Isabella asked with 8-year-old logic. That's what you taught me to do when I hurt someone's feelings. Richard Bennett looked at this little girl, whose medical trust fund he'd created as leverage in an emotional manipulation, and seemed to see clearly for the first time in decades. His grandiose schemes and financial power meant nothing to a child who simply wanted the adults in her life to stop fighting and start loving each other. You're right, he said quietly, his voice breaking. I should say sorry. He turned to Thomas. I'm sorry for destroying your career because I was too much of a coward to face my own guilt. I'm sorry for using my daughter's happiness as a bargaining chip. I'm sorry for creating pain where I should have been creating healing. Thomas stared at this man who had systematically dismantled his life, searching for sincerity in an apology that came 3 years too late. Sorry doesn't give me back the years I lost practicing medicine. Sorry doesn't undo the damage to my reputation or the financial struggles we've endured. No, Richard agreed. But maybe action can begin to repair what words never could. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew another set of documents. Not adoption papers or trust fund agreements, but medical board reinstatement forms and letters of recommendation from prominent physicians throughout Texas. I've spent the past month using every connection I have to clear the way for your return to medicine, Richard said. Austin Methodist has agreed to review your case with new evidence about the political pressure that influenced the original investigation. The medical board is prepared to hold expedited hearings for license reinstatement. Why? Thomas asked suspiciously. What's the catch? No catch, Richard replied. No conditions, no strings attached. Whether Sophia chooses to return to her previous life or build a new one with you, your medical career should be restored. You're a gifted surgeon who lost everything for making the right choice. That injustice ends now. Sophia studied her father's face, searching for the manipulation she'd learned to expect. Instead, she found something she hadn't seen since childhood, genuine remorse mixed with desperate hope for redemption. What about the engagement? She asked. The business arrangements with Senator Morrison's family? Cancelled, Richard said simply. I've already spoken with Jonathan and his father. They're disappointed but understand that forced marriages rarely produce successful political partnerships anyway. The room fell silent as three adults processed the collapse of plans and deceptions that had shaped years of their lives. Isabella continued playing with her coloring book, occasionally looking up at the grown-ups who seemed to be working through problems too complicated for 8-year-old understanding. So, what happens now? Sophia asked finally. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since learning her true identity. Not the billionaire's daughter who had deceived him, not the symbol of everything he couldn't provide Isabella, but the woman who had learned to make breakfast from his 8-year-old daughter and who read bedtime stories with genuine delight. Now we figure out what we actually want, he said. Not what we think we should want, not what other people expect us to want. What we actually want for ourselves and for Isabella. I want us to be a family, Isabella announced without looking up from her coloring. The real kind, where people choose each other every day because they love each other. From the mouths of babes came wisdom that three complicated adults had been too damaged to see clearly. The truth wasn't about money or social status or career ambitions. It was about people choosing to love and support each other despite imperfections, despite complicated histories, despite the many ways the world tried to pull them apart. Richard Bennett watched his daughter and the man he'd wronged, and the little girl who had called him on his failures, and understood for the first time that real wealth couldn't be measured in dollars or influence. It was measured in moments of genuine connection, in forgiveness offered and accepted, in the courage to build something beautiful from the ruins of past mistakes. The question now was whether any of them had the strength to do the hard work of rebuilding trust and creating the family that Isabella saw so clearly in her 8-year-old heart. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the hallway of Austin Methodist Hospital, adjusting his surgical scrubs with hands that remembered the familiar weight of saving lives. His medical license had been fully restored 2 weeks earlier, and today marked his first surgery since the night that had changed everything. The irony wasn't lost on him that his return to medicine was funded by the same man who had orchestrated his exile. Richard Bennett had proven surprisingly true to his word. The political machinery that had once destroyed Thomas's career now worked in his favor, clearing legal obstacles and restoring professional relationships with surgical precision. Hospital administrators who had once avoided his calls now welcomed him back with carefully worded apologies and strategic forgetfulness about past conflicts. The patient waiting for him was Maria Santos, a 34-year-old teacher with 2 young children and a heart defect that required the kind of delicate repair work Thomas had once performed routinely. She was uninsured, her case approved through a new charitable program that Richard had established at the hospital, one that prioritized medical need over ability to pay. Dr. Miller? The surgical nurse's voice carried respectful deference that Thomas had forgotten he'd missed. We're ready when you are. As Thomas scrubbed his hands with methodical precision, he thought about the strange mathematics of redemption. Richard Bennett's guilt had destroyed one career and now had created another. The same man who had punished Thomas for choosing compassion over protocol was now funding a medical program built entirely on that principle. Through the observation window, Thomas could see Sophia in the family waiting area, holding Isabella's hand as they worked together on a crossword puzzle. She had moved back into his modest house a month earlier, bringing nothing but a single suitcase and a determination to build a life based on choice rather than circumstance. The transition hadn't been seamless. Sophia struggled with the daily challenges of middle-class existence. Grocery shopping within a budget, comparison shopping for Isabella's school supplies, the constant awareness of money as a finite resource rather than an abstract concept. But she approached these challenges with the same intensity she'd once applied to charity board meetings, treating domestic competence as a skill worth mastering. Isabella had adapted to their new family structure with the resilience of childhood, though she still occasionally asked when they were getting married and whether she could call Sophia Mom instead of Sophia. These questions came with increasing frequency as their domestic routine solidified into something that felt genuinely familial. The surgery proceeded flawlessly, Thomas's hands moving with muscle memory that had never truly faded. Each suture was placed with the precision that had once made him chief of cardiac surgery, guided by knowledge that legal troubles couldn't erase. As he worked, Thomas felt the familiar satisfaction of using his skills for their intended purpose, healing people who needed healing, regardless of their ability to pay. When he emerged from the operating room 4 hours later, Sophia and Isabella were still in the waiting area, now sharing a book about horses that Isabella had chosen from the hospital gift shop. The sight of them together, Sophia's designer background invisible beneath a simple sweater and jeans, Isabella's head resting against Sophia's shoulder, created a picture of family that wasn't built on grand romantic gestures, but on quiet daily choices to care for each other. "How did it go?" Sophia asked, looking up from the book. "Perfectly," Thomas replied, pulling off his surgical cap. "Maria Santos is going to make a full recovery. She'll be able to watch her children graduate, walk them down the aisle, meet her grandchildren." Isabella beamed with pride. "Daddy saves people's hearts," she announced to the waiting room at large, causing several families to smile at her 8-year-old certainty about her father's heroic status. That evening, as they sat around Thomas's small dining table sharing takeout Chinese food, Richard Bennett appeared at their front door with an awkwardness that suggested he wasn't entirely sure of his welcome. He'd been making tentative overtures toward building a relationship with Isabella, his only grandchild, but the process was complicated by decades of emotional distance and his complete inexperience with children. "I brought ice cream," he announced, holding up a bag from an expensive gelato shop as if it were a peace offering. Isabella immediately brightened. "What kind?" "I wasn't sure what you liked," Richard admitted, "so I bought one of everything." This turned out to be literally true. The bag contained 12 different flavors of artisanal gelato, enough to feed a small party. Isabella's eyes widened with delight as she contemplated the unprecedented variety of dessert options. "Grandpa Richard doesn't understand moderation," Sophia explained to Isabella, though her tone carried affection rather than criticism. As they sampled various gelato flavors, Richard cleared his throat with the formal manner he adopted when discussing serious topics. "I wanted to tell you both about some changes I'm making to my business practices. I'm establishing a foundation focused on healthcare access for underserved communities. The goal is to fund programs like the one at Methodist, where medical decisions are based on need rather than ability to pay." Thomas looked up from his bowl of pistachio gelato. "That's a significant shift from your previous business model." "My previous business model was built on the assumption that financial success equaled moral success," Richard replied. "I've learned that assumptions can be expensive in ways that don't show up on balance sheets." Isabella, who had been listening to this adult conversation with the selective attention of childhood, suddenly looked up. "Does this mean you're not sad about my birth grandma anymore?" The question caught Richard off guard. He'd been careful to keep his explanations about Maria Gonzalez age-appropriate, but Isabella had absorbed more of the complex adult emotional dynamics than anyone had realized. "I think," Richard said carefully, That I'm learning that being sad about losing someone doesn't mean I have to be afraid of loving other people. Your birth grandmother would want me to take good care of you and your daddy and Sophia, not spend my time being scared of losing you." Isabella nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old understanding of how emotions should work. "Mrs. Henderson says love makes more love, like planting seeds that grow more flowers." Thomas watched his daughter dispense wisdom with the casual confidence of childhood and marveled at how children often understood emotional truths that adults spent years trying to rationalize. Love wasn't a finite resource that diminished when shared. It was renewable energy that grew stronger through use. As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself observing this unlikely family gathering: a billionaire learning to be a grandfather, a society woman mastering the art of normal conversation, an 8-year-old girl bridging generational gaps with innocent questions and generous acceptance. They weren't the family any of them had planned or expected, but they were becoming the family each of them needed. Outside, Austin's summer heat was finally breaking into the cooler temperatures of early fall, and Thomas realized that they had survived the crisis that had brought them together. Now came the harder work of building something lasting from the foundation of love, forgiveness, and the daily choice to keep showing up for each other, even when it was difficult. The future stretched ahead with all its uncertainties, but for the first time in years, Thomas felt prepared to face whatever challenges came next. They would face them together as a family, not because circumstances had forced them together, but because they had chosen each other again and again until those choices became unshakable commitment. Dear friends, this story touches something profound in all our hearts: the universal longing for family, belonging, and second chances that don't diminish with age. Thomas's journey reminds us that life's greatest chapters often begin when we think our story is ending. At 34, he lost everything he'd built, yet found something more precious than career success: authentic love and chosen family. Richard Bennett's transformation shows us it's never too late to heal old wounds and build bridges instead of walls. How many of us have carried guilt that poisoned our relationships with those we love most? How often have we let pride prevent us from accepting help or offering forgiveness? Sophia's courage to choose love over luxury speaks to every heart that has wondered if genuine connection still exists in our disconnected world. Isabella's innocent wisdom that families are made of people who choose each other daily cuts through all our complicated adult reasoning to the simple truth: love multiplies when shared. It never divides. This story reminds us that our most meaningful relationships often come disguised as interruptions to our planned lives, arriving when we least expect them, but need them most. What unexpected person has brought the greatest blessing to your life? Have you ever had to choose between financial security and following your heart? And what did you learn from that choice? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories matter and help create community among us all.